Russians have demonstrated throughout this war so far their total inability to conduct offensive operations. And I suspect the Ukrainians will be, if that build-up is as it's described, the Ukrainians will be seeking to strike it before it ever gets into the fight. And even if it does come forward, the Russians, perhaps it'll change, but so far in this war, they have shown a total inability to conduct what we in the military call combined arms manoeuvre.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today I am joined by a retired two-star general, Major General Rupert Jones. General Jones was one of the British Army's youngest commanders. He was deputy commander of the international coalition that defeated ISIS. He led the British brigade of more than 5,000 troops on combat operations in Afghanistan, and before retirement was UK Standing Joint Force Commander. Among his current roles, he is a commentator on the war in Ukraine. Rupert Jones, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline. You join us at a time that we're a month into the counteroffensive in Ukraine. And this week, President Zelensky admitted that the progress was slower than desired. But there does appear to be three fronts opening up.
Yeah, I think that, and a pleasure to be with you, Kate. And I think you describe it really well. So a month in, inevitably there was a huge amount of build-up, wasn't there? Internationally, we were all waiting for the offensive. It was about building up, Western equipment. So nations felt they had a kind of vested interest in this. And so we're all waiting for it to start. And of course, we're used to things in our lives happening very quickly. So the offensive starts, and there's somehow an expectation that there'll be quick gains. And of course, sadly, war often isn't like that. So we've had a slow and a steady first month. As I say, as you suggest, President Zelensky, I guess, tempering our expectations. But what matters in war is we don't talk about speed, we talk about tempo. And what tempo is your progress in relation to your adversaries. And over the last month, Ukraine has had the momentum. Ukraine is doing more things to the Russians than the Russians are doing to Ukraine. So there is definitely forward momentum. It's slow and it's deliberate. As you say, it feels as though three fronts are forming. Up in the Kharkiv area, around Bakhmut in the center, and then down in Kherson, where of course the dam was destroyed a little over a month ago.
And UK Defence Intelligence tweeted this week that Russia appears to have used many more anti-tank mines than had previously been thought. How much is this actually slowing the Ukrainian advance, though?
Yeah, I think this is, again, people, we have a kind of an idealized version of war that, we see in films, on computer games, and the reality is just not like that. So the Russians have had months and months to prepare for this. In the same way as the Ukrainians were getting all their equipment ready, Western equipment, they were training, the Russians weren't sitting idle. They are past masters at preparing defences. And in some places, the front line, the defensive crust, runs 30 kilometres deep. So just picture that, 30 kilometres of minefields, of ditches, of obstacles that the poor Ukrainian soldiers have got to fight their way through. And as you suggest, key to that is mines. And mines they're very, very frightening. Because you can't see them, and they're catastrophic to vehicles and clearly kill people in a kind of from nowhere.
And how can Ukrainian forces make those slow, steady steps forward with those mines, surrounded by those minefields, and yet avoid becoming sitting ducks for artillery attacks and air attacks?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen over the last month is the Ukrainians, what we would call in the military, reconnaissance by fire. So they've been probing their way forward, trying to see where they're almost testing the defences, seeing where the defence is. And although they'll have done the aerial imagery, so they kind of in theory know what's there, but you can't see everything from above. You've got to close with those defences and see how well or otherwise the Russian defenders actually fight. So once you've identified, okay, there's an area where you think you might be able to to break through. There's a number of things that we would typically do as a military force, some of which is not available to the Ukrainians. So the first thing you will do is you'll try and attack your enemy in the rear. And this is clearly what the Ukrainians are doing. So you'll try and write down their reserves, hit their logistic bases, hit their roads and rail network, destroy their command nodes behind the front line. And that has definitely been happening. Ukrainians have been doing that. So you'd expect to see that. You'd then expect to see some kind of big barrage of artillery, and the Ukrainians have artillery, but also of air support. All Western wars that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is a big aerial campaign that precedes a land operation. And of course, the Ukrainians lack air forces. They've got their own, of course, but they don't have enough. And that's why President Zelensky has said time and time again he needs F-16 jets, because he's trying to break through these defences sort of with one hand tied behind his back. The idea that we, the British and our American friends and others, would assault through these sort of defences without air support. The reality is we just wouldn't wish to do that.
So is there anything that the Ukrainian forces can actually do to mitigate the fact they don't have air supremacy as they make these advances?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is where we as the supporting nations are equally learning a lot from our Ukrainian friends, because they have made a virtue of fighting in the absence of all the tools you would typically need. And of course, they're better equipped now than they were a year ago. But we've seen, since the start of the war, their ingenuity, their innovation, their ability to somehow make do and mend, find smart new tactics. And they'll be doing that at the moment. So, where you might try and do a big offensive through, break through, use your engineering vehicles to get through the minefields, those options are probably not available to the Ukrainians. So they will be trying to find other ways through. And I say what they've demonstrated successfully in the past, they did this in Kherson at the back end of last year, is they never really fought for Kherson. They didn't want to. They didn't want to have to fight their way into the city with huge, the inevitable casualties that would be involved. They'd also cause huge amount of damage to their own city. So they defeated the Russians in the rear. They destroyed their supply lines. They destroyed their logistic depots. And so ultimately, they took the city, not quite without fighting, but the Russians withdrew. So it's hard to the Ukrainians very sensibly they're not talking too much about what their overall tactic is. But I suspect that they're doing that. They're trying to just write down the Russians, create these conditions such that they can then, when they choose to, they can move through. So the other thing that, of course, they've been doing is, for months and months, there's been this focus on Bakhmut. There's been, talked about various as a meat grinder and all sorts of unpleasant phrases. Then on the face of it, the Russians secured eight weeks or so ago. But the Ukrainians haven't laid down. They are fighting back in and around Bakhmut for two reasons, I would wager. The first is that Bakhmut, to some degree, gave President Putin some sense of a win. He hadn't had a win for months and months and months, and he could say, well, I fought for Bakhmut and I've taken it. And President Zelensky doesn't want to give him that win. But secondly, what Bakhmut has done very powerfully for the Ukrainians is it has drawn in Russian forces, fixed huge amounts of Russian forces in what is strategically a fairly irrelevant place. And he continues to do that, President Zelensky, because he's trying to, say, minimize the amount of reserves that the Russians have at their disposal to defend elsewhere on the front. So fix everybody in Bakhmut, and then I suspect you'll want to try and break somewhere else.
And now, though, there are reports of a Russian buildup of troops north of Bakhmut in Crimea, some tens of thousands. We don't know exactly how many. What is the potential, as some people say, for a Russian counteroffensive now? How significant is that buildup, do you think?
Yeah, we've seen this in the past, and on the face of it, of course, it's a threat, And we always say in the military, the best form of defense is offense. So yes, if we were in the Russians' shoes, we'd probably be looking to try and take the fight back to the Ukrainians. Does it concern me unduly? No, because the Russians have demonstrated throughout this war so far their total inability to conduct offensive operations. And I suspect the Ukrainians will be, if that build-up is as it's described, the Ukrainians will be seeking to strike it before ever gets into the fight. And even if it is brought, even if it does come forward, the Russians, perhaps it'll change, but so far in this war, they have shown a total inability to conduct what we in the military call combined arms maneuver. Combined arms maneuver is just bringing together all the different bits or in your fighting arsenal. So your infantry, your tanks, your engineers, your mine clearers, your artillery, your air support, your drones, your intelligence, all these things have to come together in what we call the orchestra of war. And it's really hard, and we, the West, should be cautious of being too critical because, we haven't done it for a while ourselves, and it's really, really hard to do. But boy, oh boy, the Russians have struggled to do it. So I've seen no evidence that the Russians are going to suddenly be able to be masters of that level of skill.
And yet we still haven't seen Ukrainian forces at the height of their combined arms maneuver either, have we?
No, certainly of late they haven't been able to. They have demonstrated in the past. They're an unusual military because, of course, they've had to bring all sorts of people into uniform since the war started. The West have given any number of different types of equipment that they've tried to kind of cobble together into ad hoc units. But they're not a perfectly formed, organized and equipped military. They're a military of necessity, if you like. But we have seen them fight in their own ingenious version of combined arms maneuver. So when they made a big breakthrough in the north around Kharkiv in the autumn of last year, that was really impressive. They at a strategic level, they got everybody looking south. They drew the Russian reserves, and when everyone was looking the other way, they broke through the front. And you remember they took a lot of terrain really very fast. That was combined arms maneuver.
And we haven't yet seen the 9 highly trained armour brigades deployed yet. In what circumstances do you think they will be?
Yeah, so if you like, for the Ukrainians, they feel a bit like the crown jewels at the moment. There's been a huge amount of work on the diplomatic side to draw those equipments together to train their troops in the UK and elsewhere. So these are their prize assets. And they can ill afford to waste them because 9 brigades sounds an awful lot, but they can get frittered away very, very quickly on a high intensity battlefield. So I suspect what they will be doing is keeping their conceptual powder dry for when there really is a big push. And it feels like they're pressing on a broad front, and they're firing artillery in depth to right down the enemy's logistics. But it doesn't feel as though they're kind of trying to, really, slice a hot knife through butter to create a channel through which you can then flow your forces. So I don't know, but it feels as though they're preserving their crown jewels for that big breakthrough. Because what they don't want to do is see those forces just slowly written down on an attrition basis.
The challenges facing Ukraine's forces are considerable. The anti-tank mines, the fact they have fewer troops, the lack of air superiority. What strengths do you think they can be drawing on?
Oh, so the strengths they have are the strengths they've had all the way through. And it's the strengths that the Russians have demonstrated a total inability to deal with. And that is mental. They're just not going to give up their terrain. They're united. They're fighting for the very fabric of their nations. They're fighting for their mothers, their brothers, their sisters, their friends. That is so powerful. And you compare that with a Russian conscript who wants to be anywhere but in Bakhmut. So they have this incredible desire to defend their families, their homes, their nation. So that is a almost unbreakable rock. And then around that, what they've demonstrated is, they're just good fighters. That they're determined, they're courageous, and they are the masters of ingenuity. You look at how they initially defended their capital, last year. The military were doing it, but citizens were taking up arms, and they were receiving over the internet, low-level versions of how you defend a city. How do I defend my home, my house, my street? How do I team up with my neighbors? I mean, that's really powerful, and that's golden.
And how much of an advantage do you think the Ukrainian forces have, given that they've evolved from the Soviet era with all that meant for military command and control structures, and they've been absorbed and trained now by Western forces and learnt the Western way of doing military combat?
Yeah, so they've as you say, their origins come from a Soviet military. But they've been facing more and more towards the West, over a long period of time. And from 2014, 2015, after the invasion of Crimea, some Western nations, the United Kingdom, the US, Canada, have been giving training support to the Ukrainians, very carefully calibrated, largely defensive in nature. But that's really kick-started a relationship, a very personal relationship between Ukrainian commanders and Western commanders. And so doctrine has been discussed, relations have grown. And so you've had an iterative, if you like, switch from a Eastern trained and educated military more and more to one that understands, the Western way, if you like.
But do you think that background, the Soviet background, actually gives commanders an advantage because they understand the Russian way of thinking about war?
Yeah, I think it does. I think they're up against people who they've the senior Ukrainians. They've been part of that organization, so they understand the Russians' doctrine, frankly, better than we would do in Britain or France or Germany. Because they've lived that doctrine. So in a way, they've got the best of all worlds. So they understand how the Russians do their business. They've been increasingly educated and trained in the Western way. And then over the top of it, they've got this this absolutely furious desire to defend their nation.
You mentioned earlier how the Russians are not very good at attacking. Who do you think is devising the strategy for Russian troops at the moment, and how clear do you think it is?
Yeah, well, again, I think this has been one of their really real problems. From the very outset, their strategy has been flawed. I mean, it just has been. Ukraine is a vast country, and they I forget how many troops they had at the start of the war, but it was simply insufficient to subjugate a country of Ukraine's size. So that comes from President Putin. So from the very top, from the very outset, the strategy totally flawed. They underestimated the Ukrainians, they underestimated Western nations, they overestimated their own military prowess. So it goes wrong from the very start. What we've then seen all the way through the war is almost musical chairs of military commanders, with different people being put in command of different bits of the Ukrainian campaign. The only people who've kind of kept their jobs in all of this has been Putin, Lavrov as foreign minister, Shoigu as defense minister, and then Gerasimov, the overall military chief. They've kind of kept their jobs, but as in terms of commanders on the ground, it's been musical chairs. Every time things have been going well, Putin has done what typically happens when you're losing. You throw your toys out of the pram and you go, well, he can't do it, so I'll put somebody else in. And so just by putting somebody else in without changing a strategy is gonna change the outcome. As far as taking Gerasimov, who's Putin's military advisor, and saying, well, you're now in charge of the operation down in Ukraine. I mean, really ill-conceived. General Sorovkin, who I've come across in Syria days, being put in charge, and then we think he's been arrested. So again, that's really undermining. And at no point in moving your commanders, what they haven't done is fundamentally addressed the flaw in their strategy and their flaw in their fighting prowess.
But do we even know that General Gerasimov is still in charge?
Well, we know, I think, as well as we can do, that General Gerasimov is still, the overall chief in Moscow, and that Shoigu is still the defense minister. I've certainly seen nothing to suggest otherwise. We know that Prigozhin, before his coup or mutiny, or call it what you like, a week or so ago with the Wagner group, we know that he wanted to see part of it. What it really seemed to be was a cry for help, that I'm not happy that my Wagner mercenaries are being resubordinated under the Ministry of Defense. And oh, by the way, I really don't like the defense minister, Shoigu, so I want him gone. I don't like Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces. I want him gone. And it seems he overplayed his hand. So, if Putin does now sack his defense minister and his military chief, it feels as though he's kind of just kowtowing to the mutineer.
The head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Major General Budanov, reports that Russia is divided now on President Putin's future after this mutinous march by the Wagner group. Is there now a stronger likelihood that the end of this war will be decided by events in Russia rather than on the battlefield?
I mean, there's always been, events in Ukraine will ultimately, as in all wars, will come to a conclusion, not on the battlefield, but around some table somewhere. There's always a settlement. War always ends in some form of talking, and the trick is to be in as advantageous position on the ground as you can when that talking really takes place. I mean, it certainly feels as though Putin's position is weakened by recent events. I mean, he would violently disagree with me, of course. He's speaking at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the last day or so. He says Russia is united as never before by recent events. I mean, the intellectual underpinning of that is pretty flawed. But the narrative that Moscow is trying to put out is, look, we dealt with that mutiny, that coup attempt, and we did it through unity. Our brave, plucky servicemen defeated it, which couldn't be further from the truth. So, he's trying to create this narrative that we faced it down, we dealt with it, and therefore we're even stronger than before. That's just not backed up by the facts. Putin is undoubtedly weakened by what's happened in the last week or so. But where I would be cautious of is to say that then means that, okay, so we've had one attempt, there's more to come. There's more mutiny in the works, because the Russian system's pretty powerful at kind of crushing, getting out into the works. There's this sense that General Sorovkin may or may not have known about the mutiny attempt. Has he been arrested? It looks though he has. He certainly has been seen. So if I'm a potential future mutineer, how does that feel?
And does it matter where Yevgeny Prigozhin is? Because the reports are now saying he's back in Russia, he's in St. Petersburg. Does it matter?
I think it probably does matter, in that Prigozhin has been, no matter what you might think of him, and he's a murderous thug, but he has been a significant player in this war. He was a significant player with the Wagner group on the battlefield, and he's definitely been a significant player in terms of kind of the Moscow power dynamics. And he did play his hand, and it blew back on him. And so I think we shouldn't ignore him. the idea that he's just gone from the works, I don't think we should conclude that, and therefore, I think we do care where he is. I'm pretty certain President Putin cares where he is, because he's got a following in Russia, and Putin will be mindful of that. So I think we've all got an interest in Prigozhin, and I think we probably do want to know where he is. We do want to know ultimately what he's up to. Is he out of the game? Is he not out of the game? My sense, he's probably not fully out of the game, and he might be licking his wounds, but he's still a player.
And how much do you think the Ukrainian and Russian leadership will be looking at the looming NATO conference next week and thinking that right now is the moment to say and do things that might influence the way this war goes, or influence the way NATO reacts next week?
Yeah, so when the Vilnius Summit coming up, it's hugely important. NATO summits are always important. This one, more so than ever. They've got a very busy agenda, I suspect. But just as it relates to Ukraine, it really matters. And they will. Jens Stoltenberg, who I personally think it's a very good thing that he's being extended in post. He's hugely experienced, and you want a steadying hand at the moment. And I'm sure what he will want to do is try and ensure that NATO puts across a really unified front as it relates to the messaging around Ukraine, support to Ukraine in the current fight, but also a unified message about Ukraine's future pathway into NATO. Understandably, individual nations will have a slightly different perspective on exactly what they want that to look like. But Stoltenberg will be trying to ensure that by the end of the conversation, that the collective messaging is unified and strong.
Ukraine will be looking for some kind of future security guarantee as it waits to join NATO, short of joining it. What could that look like?
Yeah, I mean, President Zelensky's, he's nothing if not a pragmatist, and he said, and he knows that what he's not going to get is, Ukraine's not going to be able to join NATO whilst the war is on. He knows that. So, my sense is, based on what's being said, is that what he's looking for is a really strong undertaking by the NATO collective alliance about an undertaking about future membership after the war, and a strong description of what the pathway to membership looks like. What he won't want is something that feels like playing membership into the long grass, some kind of membership pathway that just kind of in reality means that it's 10 or 15 or 20 years hence. And historically, there's a map that you have to follow to join NATO. That's been waived in the case of Finland in the last year. It's been waived in the case of Sweden, but of course, Turkey is currently blocking Sweden's membership. So, he'll be looking for some kind of equivalent pathway that doesn't feel like Ukraine's membership is being played into the long grass. And he'll be looking for continuing security guarantees. Of course, the reality is, and I think the Estonian Prime Minister made this comment recently, the only way you get complete security guarantees is by membership of NATO. Until that point, yes, you can have security undertakings, and that's what Western nations have been delivering to Ukraine over the last year. But only NATO membership gives you that absolute guarantee of attack on one is an attack on all.
And just finally, in all your years in the military, did you ever expect that we would be facing the situation we face today with this war in Europe?
Well, I think the one thing I learned in 30 plus years in the military is that the one thing is to expect the unexpected, and that no matter how good your intelligence is, no matter how good your policy forecasts are, it's always the unexpected. And that, oh, by the way, war is in itself then hugely unpredictable. It's a competition. And, my last role, we spent quite a lot of time facing east, looking at, the Russia problem, if you like. Most of my focus was coming at from more of a Northern European Baltic perspective. But you know, the writing's been on the wall for a really quite long time, hasn't it, about Putin's behaviour? You could have ignored his behaviour for as long as you want, but you certainly couldn't from 2014 onwards, when he went into Crimea. And the three Baltic states in particular were then saying, look, you know, unless we take strong act, we're next. And off the back of that, you know, we have put a forward presence into those three Baltic states, then into Poland, and more recently into some other nations as well. And that was done because we were all saying, well, look, we can conceive of this happening. President Putin is, in my judgment, an opportunist. He's not a grand strategist. He's an opportunist. And we collectively have given him opportunity. And we failed to act in 2014, 2015. And so he thought, well, there's further opportunity in Ukraine, and he's taken it. And that's why the three Baltic states were so strong in their resolution in 2015-ish to say, you've got to put Western forces into our nations in a kind of in a what we call enhanced forward presence. So if President Putin, if you take Estonia, where British forces are based, and by the way, why did we pick Estonia? We picked Estonia because the Estonians fought with us in Helmand province in Afghanistan. You know, we spilt blood alongside the Estonians, and I was involved in this. So why did we pick Estonia rather than Latvia or Lithuania? Well, because we'd fought with them. You know, we already had that bondship. And so the kind of thinking goes, you know, if Putin thinks there's an opportunity in Estonia to just slink his way in and hope that NATO nations will think, well, you know, it's right up in the east, we don't really worry about that, do we? Well, that calculus feels a bit different when there's British troops up there, you know, when there's Canadian troops, when there's German troops. And what you're trying to say to Putin is, there is no opportunity here. And he is an opportunist. And so, you know, his saber rattling about nuclear weapons, for me, feels like saber rattling. Because I think, you know, since the invasion of Ukraine, he's seeing a pretty strong message that, right, there's real consequences. And I think he knows that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, I don't think NATO would use a nuclear weapon in response necessarily. But my God, they'd mallet Moscow. And I would expect the Kremlin to be in a burning wreckage soon thereafter. Putin's not a fool. He knows that.
Major General Rupert Jones, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.